Hello, it's your friendly neighborhood host, JT Weed here again, back for another episode of the History of Comic Books podcast. This time, being episode number 50, we're going to do a history of the History of Comic Books podcast. How's it going to work? Well, I figured I'd just give you a little more instruction about how I became to be a giant comic book fan and a history fan, and of course, podcaster in general. And it's obviously going to be the most boring subject this series ever hold, but it's always good a little background to see where I'm from. And more reason why you could blame past events why you're stuck with this podcast series. With that, let's get going. Basically, I started out as a comic book fan like most kids. You'll pick up comics here and there, you read them, enjoy them, stuff like that. Like everything else, cartoons, movies, and stuff. But it's like just part of life. And then one day, back when my mom was grocery shopping, this is back when the grocery stores had a nice comic book rack. She would always sit me right there next to the comic book rack and let me just sit there while she did the grocery shopping. And I go, okay, that's fun. And that was back when you could leave a kid doing that. And plus, it was a well view of the cashiers, so no one wanted to steal me. And who would want to kidnap me anyway? Trust me, they'd give me back pretty quick. But I was perusing the comic books, and I noticed there was Iron Man number 229 by Bob Michelin and by Dave Michelin and Bob Layden, in which you see Iron Man, and what I didn't realize at the time was his stealth armor fighting the Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo, and on the cover it proclaimed, "And one dies." I go, what? Someone dies in a comic book? That's weird. Picked it up, and my goodness, someone does die in that comic book. Not going to give the full spoilers away. It's part of the classic Armor Wars series. It's the story that really got me into comic books in general, because it was a story that showed Iron Man, who's supposed to be a good guy, kind of doing bad things for an overall good cause, and it showed a little interesting shade of gray, and I realized, whoa, there's something more to these comic books. These are fully fresh characters. Their motivations may be pure, but their actions may not be show. The bad guys aren't completely that bad. Plus, the art was gorgeous and crisp and realistic. Layden and Michelin just made some beautiful work in general. And Armor Wars is easily one of the top comic books of all time, but definitely check it out. It's also the reason, incidentally, why Iron Man is my all-time favorite character, because that issue alone right there was just brilliant, and I've been hooked ever since. And with that, comic books became a big thing, and soon I wanted to find how do I get to comic books faster and faster, and I realized, oh wait, they come out once a week, how do I get to them? And that's when I realized, oh wait, there's a magazine shop just a mile from my house. Can my mom drive me down there? She goes, no, you're old enough, jog down there. I go, okay. And then that's also how I got into jogging too, so I just jogged down the mile down, used my allowance, buy my comic books at the magazine rack, and jogged back, and that's where the obsession really started to take hold, because I actually started keeping these comic books too. So that original Iron Man 229, I beat it up pretty well, so it's not more worth anything. It disappeared, but it's gone for good. And then later on, my mom did start driving me to a comic book store, and my goodness, that was nirvana right there. That was like there were comic books and trade paperbacks and all different kinds and different companies and boards and bags. And I discovered, wait, long box, you can collect them and keep them in good condition. That was brilliant, and I just went from there. And sure enough, and I just bounced from comic book store to comic book store. And whenever I would move, I would always try to find me a comic book store to get my weekly pull list. And oh wait, you could tell them what comic books to keep every week, and you can come pick them up, and they'll be ready for you. Genius. And I've loved it ever since. And my current comic book store is Borderlands in the upstate of South Carolina. Fantastic store. And who also, the owner hosts the annual South Carolina Comic Con. It's easily one of my favorite comic book stores ever. I go there every week, share it on the button, and I'm almost like a Norm at Cheers. They see me and go, hey, Jonathan. Like, yeah, that's how bad I am. But it's great. And I've been a lifelong comic book fan ever since. And as a result, you start to study. You want to go, well, who were the writers? Who were the artists? Like, how did this come about? What's the history behind the history? And that's where my interest began. It helped that my dad, when I was still a teenager, gave me the comic book, a book that gave the history of comic books, which was incidentally, the basis for the first few episodes, that overview about all the history of comic books in general. And I go, oh, there were people behind this? Let's check this out. And sure enough, I loved it. I love getting into the controversies like Stan Lee versus Jack Kirby, or how Bill Finger was denied credit for helping co-create Batman with Bob Kane and all that stuff. And it just went from there. And I just started digging into it. As much as I love comic books, I love the stories behind them. And I decided, I would love to one day do it. And I'll be honest, I've actually tried to be a comic book writer and artist, and I've learned very quickly I can't write. Well, at least not fiction. I can't draw. Not very good at all. But I always I want to do something with this, something at all. And later on, as I got older, and of course, this is a more recent time, a few years ago, I discovered podcasting. And I have a job where it allows me to listen to 5-6 hours of podcast a day because I'm in my car all day listening to the radio, and you start developing all sorts of taste. And of course, when smartphone technology came on, the wonderful device called podcasting did. And podcasting is truly a revolutionary for the audio medium because unlike terrestrial radio now, which I hardly ever listen to, it's either just talk shows, sports, or music. And nothing new. There's no more audio dramas, no more radio plays or long-form interviews or comedy shows or anything of that nature. It's just jaded. But you go to a podcasting, you go to just iTunes or Stitcher or Spreaker, there is a podcast for literally anything. There's a podcast in the history of the Crusades, the history of Rome. There's podcasts about people joking about watching movies. There's great stuff all around. The entry medium for the medium is very low. Anyone with a laptop and a GarageBand program, which is literally what I'm doing right now, can log on, start a podcast, subscribe to a hosting service like Libsyn, which I use, and you can have your podcast on iTunes in a day. You make it yourself, and it's great. And like I said, the entry is low. Now, it should be noted that after a while, the average podcast lasts 10 episodes because people just break off. It's like, oh, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. But, you got to put the grind in, put the money in. Like, here, Nerd Bliss, the fantastic podcast who gave me my kick in the pants to finally do this, they reached their 100th episode. I'm on number 50 right here. And, I actually did a few years ago think about getting into podcasting. I bought even one of those little kits on Amazon, like a podcasting equivalent, came with his own little mixer and stuff like that, and a microphone. Tried it out, couldn't get into it, but I kept a list of ideas, and I keep a scrapbook of ideas. But I do recommend people do, like, if you ever want to be creative, keep a little scrapbook of ideas of what you want to do. Maybe you might never come up with it, but just exercise your creative thoughts. But I kept a list of if I ever did a History of Comics podcast, these are the subjects I'd like to address. I had that list on me. Well, a few years go by, I meet my friends Chris and Tina Jones, and they start their own podcast, The Nerd Bliss, because, Chris will tell you he wanted to get into voiceover work. And I've heard this before from every creative person. Notably, Jack Patillo talks about from Achievement Hunter over at Rooster Teeth. You want to get into a business? Make stuff. Make stuff and put it out there. And he points to Michael Jones, who made the Rage Quit videos, where he would play video games and post them online of him screaming in rage over how hard Crackdown 2 was, and that got the attention of the world, and got the attention of Rooster Teeth, and now that man is at Rooster Teeth. He's a pivotal member of the Achievement Hunter, and he does Rage Quit videos. And also great for professional and personal life. He met his wife there, and they have 2 children now. And he's a voice artist on the anime show Fairy Tail. It's crazy, all because he made the initiative of making something and putting it out there. It may not be good. It may be bad. But it's out there, and nothing happens to people to do nothing. I mean, there's a great saying of, if you do nothing, you are guaranteed nothing will happen to you. But if you do something, something just might. And I get reminded, too, I was at a panel at DragonCon a few years back with Kelly Sue DeConnick, who was the writer, brilliant writer, also married to another brilliant writer, Matt Fraction, but she was on a comic book panel talking about writing comic books, and also of notes, Kelly Sue DeConnick, on top of all the great work she does, she's most notably right now for being the writer who converted Miss Marvel Carol Danvers into the current Captain Marvel, which of course led to the current Captain Marvel movie. And if you notice in the subway scene, when you see Captain Marvel walking around, there's a short woman with glasses and bright pink hair. That's Miss Kelly Sue DeConnick. She got a little cameo, and anyone that knows her, you can't miss her. But on this panel, she talks about how people keep coming up to her and asking, how do you get into comic books? And she goes, well, how many comic books have you written? And they go, well, I haven't written anything yet. And she replied, that's not how it works. Write bleeping comics. And that's just it. You do it. And like I said, back to the Nerd Bliss, I guest started an episode and I realized he's doing it. He's doing something. He's actually putting himself out there. I'm so impressed with Chris Jones and with Tina Jones and Eric and Heath and Dan Klink. Like they decided we're going to go and put ourselves out there, good or bad. And look, they've made 100 episodes. And they're hilarious and great. I can't wait. Every week I love listening to them. I know these are my friends. I can see them in person in real life. I love listening to subjects that go. And I get jealous when I'm not on the show. Like, oh, man, I would love to have talked about that and how Dan's so wrong that Babylon 5 is one of the best TV shows of all time. I don't care what you say, Dan. We will continue that discussion later in the future, trust me. But I decided, you know something? I've got a laptop. I got GarageBand. I've got ideas. Let's do it. And now I've done it. I've put myself out there. And I slowly discovered my process. I realized, okay, I start with research. I find me a subject, which is the main subject of every episode. Like, it's why I give credit for what this book I use. I like to have a book or something like that. And I get notes from the book, and I form the outline from the notes I take. And I originally thought, hey, let's just do the notes in the outline and see what works from there. It was horrendously bad. That first episode I recorded was so awful. It'll never see the light of day. And that's when I realized I have to write scripts to go with this and read the script. So I find myself writing scripts. And anyone who's ever written knows that the great Rod Serling, who created The Twilight Zone, will tell you about writing. Rod Serling was asked, how do you write? He says, it's easy. You get up in the morning, you have your breakfast, make some coffee, and then you sit in front of a typewriter, and you bleed. Writing is, wow. It's a great process, but it's a hard process. It's the process, especially that second draft. The first draft, not so bad because you write the first draft with your head, but the second, my mistake, you write the first draft with your heart. The second draft you write with your head. And, because you look back at that first draft, you go, what did I write? You have to go back, you have to make corrections, you have to double check, you have to go back to the original source, and you're like, But in the third draft, you double check with that too. And by the fourth draft and the fifth draft, you're polishing. And it's like, and usually by the fourth or fifth, I'm done because you realize you can't let the perfect be enemy of the good. Because at a certain point, you just put it out there. I remember I had a chance to talk to John Romita Jr. years ago on Fanboy Radio. I called in, which is another inspiration too. I wanted, these guys are talking about comic books on the radio. I want to do this one day. Another inspiration for this podcast. And I got to call and talk to him, and he actually said that he thinks the deadline is essential to him as an artist because it says, hey, you eventually have to just put the pen to paper and put out what you got. And it reminds me of a classic story that I believe is true based on all the research I've done on artists. In that years ago they claimed that the Louvre, which is the great museum in Paris, or the great art museum, all the great art is there. The Mona Lisa is there. Raphael, Michelangelo, Donatello, all the Ninja Turtles. Well, Renaissance painters, but you know what I mean. But Picasso and Monet and Van Gogh, they all have paintings hanging there. And the security guards were walking the museum. They noticed this guy would look like he was vandalizing one of the paintings. They pulled him off. Like, what are you doing? He goes, no, it's my painting. It's my painting. And they looked him up and they realized he was the painter of the painting. And he goes, will you let me finish it? Because it's not finished. I need to fix it. And the security guard had to just yell at the guy, it's in the Louvre. It's finished. You've done it. And while I will never claim that this podcast will ever be worthy of the Louvre, good grief. Charles Schultz got a showcase in the Louvre, and that man was the greatest comic strip artist of all time, but I just talk about comic books. But that's the thing, and that's the whole point. After that fourth, fifth draft of my script, I realized, all right, time to print it and record it, and that's what I do. I read the script. I like to keep it 30 minutes because I've heard the unofficial rule of any podcast is that you get 30 minutes per voice, which is why that's why I keep it up, because it's just me. I get sick of myself just talking. It's crazy. But you just keep going from there. But you have 2 voices, you get an hour, and 3 voices, you get an hour and a half, and so forth like that. For instance, one of the podcasts I listened to was a D&D podcast. It goes for 3 hours, but they got 6 or 7 people going at one time, and that never gets boring. That's another thing of advice for podcasting. Like the more voice, so use that too. If you're just one person doing like a history thing, keep it around a half an hour. You don't want to go too long. That's what Mike Duncan does for the history of Rome, and that man's a brilliant genius. Who set the standard for history podcasting. And I put it out there, and I clicked it, and I got people listening. I remember 30 people listening to my first episode. Like, whoa, I can fill a college room. Which incidentally is what the people say at the History of Germany podcast, which is pretty awesome too. Another history podcast I listen to. I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I put it out there, and I edit it, and I try to cut out those low spaces and me breathing too much. Try to fix stuff every now and then, but it's how things work. But that is it. I've now done it for 50 episodes. And thank you, everyone who has been listening. I've noticed I'm in 6 continents. It's crazy. I see people from Tasmania and South Africa, Spain, Ireland, and of course the great United States all over there, and Canada.